Hey CC family, looking forward to another week of ministry and just being able to work alongside you this week, just in terms of mentoring and discipling your children to come to know Jesus. And so I wanted to take just a moment to emphasize an announcement that we had that you'll probably see during the first and second service, and that's just to save the date for our VBS weekend, or our VBS week. So if you are free and available, July 15th to 19th, that will be the week for our VBS program. So the signups for your children, the registration for your children is going to happen at the end of this month of May. But if you are interested in volunteering and helping with VBS, there's going to be a registration link that's going to be at cec-sd.org/VBS volunteer. And so I'll make sure to put that link in the description below so that way you can just have direct access. Also, as a heads up as well, the registration fee for your children are going to be $20. But if you are a family with multiple children in the children's program, each additional child is going to be $10 as opposed to $20. So for example, if you have a family of 3 children, it will be a total of $40 altogether for your family to come and attend VBS. So just to give you that announcement before we dive into today's program. So for today, on May 12th, we're going to be covering a couple of new things, especially for the first hour. And so for the first hour, we're going to be looking at Acts chapter 9, verses 1 to 31. And this is going to cover the story of how Paul became a Christian. Now, this is a very popular passage. It's a passage that's referred to a lot, especially because of how influential and how important Paul is to the church's history. In case you weren't fully aware, most of the literature in the New Testament, most of the books that we have there are actually written by Paul. And so we actually need to understand his life story and his transition from being a non-Christian, and we'll see just how far in that camp he was, to where he is now as a believer, as someone who champions Jesus. And so in the story, we actually find that Paul is actually being referred to as Saul. That was his birth name. And so using that name, he was actually known among the Israelites and among this region as being someone who's very, very, very against Christianity. And so this man was a Jew, a follower of the law, and he did everything right. In other words, he was the model citizen for the Jewish people, someone that they would look up to, that really championed their faith. And so what he would do is he would actually journey from city to city in a way like an inquisitor, looking at different people, looking at different cities and areas, and trying to uproot any members of the Christian faith and would punish them, more often than not, with death. So this man led a massive push for persecution, this massive wave of finding Christians, pulling them out of their hiding places and putting them to death. And so if we were to just leave the story there, how could it be that this individual would come to be a champion of Christianity? Well, all of that changed in his one experience and encounter with Jesus. Now, Saul was on his way over to Damascus. He had heard rumors of Christians being in that area, and so he was on his way to persecute that group of Christians. And along that way, he had an encounter with Jesus. And in that moment, a light shone and a voice rang out that called to Saul. And it was a very simple question: why are you persecuting me? Now, further in that conversation, we find out that was Jesus' voice, and that Jesus is calling out to Saul to have him have a heart check, to realize the sin that he had been engaged with, and how he had been personally persecuting Jesus by persecuting his followers. Now, something that's not always mentioned in that story is that there were actually other people that were there with Saul, other people who had a very similar experience, except the only different factor was Saul ended up being blind as a result of that interaction. The other men did not. And so they helped Saul into the nearby city. And so in that moment, Saul is wrestling with, who is this Jesus? I thought I knew who he was. I thought I understood, but something's different, something's unique. This person that they're calling out to, we know that he died. We know that he was crucified. And whether I believe or not that he was resurrected, that was most definitely his voice calling out to me. So all of these things that these Christians are talking about and sharing about must be true, because I was able to experience Jesus myself. And in that time, we actually see just how other people viewed Saul and were terrified of Saul. And so there's an important man named Ananias, a Christian, a believer, a follower of Jesus. And Jesus reached out to Ananias and said, hey, I want you to meet with Saul because he needs your help. And of course, Ananias says, Jesus, why would you have me do that? You know who he is. You know he's been persecuting Christians. I don't want to put my head on the chopping block. What are you thinking? But Jesus still worked through Ananias and calmed his nerves and allowed for the two of them to meet. And that's when Saul had a really impactful moment of change, because he actually got to meet not only Jesus, but meet a follower of Jesus and got to see what their lives were like. And that's when Saul was healed of his blindness and began the transformation of his heart. And so immediately after meeting Ananias, immediately after being healed, he went throughout all of Damascus and shared about Jesus. Now this is a huge flip, a huge change, where originally Saul had been persecuting Christians to now he's proclaiming Jesus, the very person, the very Messiah that all of these people were proclaiming. So instead of being an enemy, he became a partner. He became a helper and a champion for that group. But still people didn't believe. Still people had doubts. And so the disciples of Jesus, those who had spent all this time following him and definitely had targets on their back, they were hearing about Saul. They knew his name. But now they're confused because Saul is doing something very different now. And so instead of welcoming him with open arms, the disciples were afraid. They thought that this was probably some clever plan that he had constructed, this espionage mission where he would pretend to be a Christian just to get close to the inner circle and then murder all of them. But Barnabas stood up for Saul. He saw all that Saul had been doing. He saw with his own eyes just how powerful Saul's transformation had become and made a case for Saul. And with much deliberation and prayer, the disciples themselves also received Saul. Now, this whole story is incredible to just think through the amount of transformation that Saul had gone through. And when we look and apply it to our lives, we can see a very clear and stark difference between who we were and who we are now in Christ. And so for your children, this is an opportunity for them to start thinking through and understanding the transformation that they're being called to undergo. That they're not just going to be living their lives the way that they've always been living, but if they were to dedicate their lives to Jesus, if they claim Jesus to be their Lord and Savior, their Messiah, that faith that they have in him will produce a great amount of change, and that their whole heart would be transformed. And so Saul was transformed so much that he saw it fitting to change his name from Saul to Paul. Now, we're not asking for your children to change their name once they have faith, but we are asking them to have faith. And that leads us into our conversation points and our discussion on this story. And so first and foremost, this is a wonderful opportunity for you as a parent, someone who's journeyed with Jesus for some time, to just describe how your heart was transformed as a result of knowing, loving, and having faith in Jesus. This is an opportunity for you to share with your child the kind of person that you were, the Saul that you once were before you knew Jesus. You could share with them about how maybe you had anxious thoughts, that you were really worried about your future. You could share about how maybe you weren't the nicest person in the world, that you were actually mean and rude and inconsiderate towards other people. Or maybe you could just say that you were afraid of the future, didn't really know what was in store for you, that the future just scared you. But now, because of Jesus, you've entered into your Paul phase, that you've become a new person, and share with your child these new characteristics that your life is currently defined by. Instead of being anxious, I am confident about who Jesus says I am. Instead of being rude and mean and a bully to other people, I'm loving and caring and patient with others. Instead of being afraid, I have full confidence knowing in Jesus and trusting Jesus. And so work with your child to show them the transformation that you went through, in hopes that they can see that this isn't just some fantastical story about someone so long ago that had that experience, but that there's still people experiencing that now, today. Another thing that you can think through, and another conversation point, is just by looking at Ananias and Barnabas, looking at those two individuals and the roles that those kinds of people can play in your lives. So for a very simple question is, who is the Ananias and who's the Barnabas in your child's life? And so if we're thinking about Ananias, who is that individual that's really going to be that disciple maker? The person that's going to be bringing your child into first knowledge of who Jesus is, but also experience of who Jesus is. Again, Saul didn't really know much experientially in terms of who Jesus was. He probably knew the facts and the details about Jesus' life, maybe some details about what he was teaching, but he never experienced them until he met Ananias. And so this is an opportunity for your child to start thinking about, well, who is it that would be discipling me? Who is it that I can look up to that could show me what it's like to be a believer, to show me what it's like to have a life dedicated to Jesus? It could be a Sunday school teacher that your child has. It could be an older family member that can walk with your child. Or it could be a friend that they have in the class that's constantly reminding them to pray, to read their Bible, to be engaged with Jesus. And then on the flip side of that question is the Barnabas. And so if we look at, again, the story that Saul had, the experience that Saul had, he needed someone like Barnabas. He needed a friend to stand with him, to journey with him. In another way to phrase that kind of relationship is almost like an accountability partner. Now, it's going to be a much simpler form of accountability with you and with your child. You know, they might not necessarily be sharing deep, intimate, soul-wrenching moments in their lives that they need an accountability partner for. But we can start laying the groundwork for that kind of relationship now. And so your child can start thinking about, well, who are some more intimate relationships that I have at church? Who are some of the friends that I have that I look forward to spending time with every single Sunday and sometimes on Fridays as well? Who are those people that I'm excited to be with, that I spend time with outside of school and of church? People that I enjoy being with. And if I have those people, maybe I can use that relationship to spring forward accountability. So instead of doing their Bible reading plans just with you, which already is a great thing, maybe they could do their Bible reading plans with their friends as well. Maybe they could talk about some of the things that they've been learning and reading about, some reflections that they've been having. Or they could just be sharing prayer requests with each other. And so this is an opportunity for you to give your child the groundwork, the foundation to build accountability relationships with other people. So that way someone else can be a testimony to you, to your child, to allow them to know what it's like to walk with other believers, to have them stand by your side and remind you, encourage you to follow after Jesus. And thirdly, this is an opportunity for your child to start thinking about their life as they come to know who Jesus is. And so the question that we have for that is more of a exercise to work through. And so to start creating a journal. Now, I've mentioned God journals before, prayer journals before, but this journal specifically would be used to start thinking through their life and their testimony. So we could just call this journal a testimony journal. And so what this is going to be used for is have them record and write down some of the interactions that they're having with Jesus now. Now, hopefully your children are at a place where they can start thinking about and wrestling with their faith, but maybe they're in that period right now where they're Saul, where they're just starting, they just met Ananias, and they're just starting to understand who Jesus is. But the transformation is still taking place. Now is an opportunity for them to start writing about the things that they're learning and the things that they're wrestling with. So when they hear things that God is loving, maybe have them write down what their thoughts are about that. Is that an encouragement? Is that a good bit of information, but I don't know how that applies to me? That's nice, but I don't really care. Whatever their thoughts, whatever their genuine thoughts are, have them write those things down. And the idea being is that they can begin to track through each of these moments, each of these thoughts that they're wrestling with, each of these moments that they're experiencing, and getting to see how Jesus is transforming those moments. And the beauty behind that is as they write down these things, as they record their personal journeys in terms of knowing, understanding, and putting faith in Jesus and trusting him, they're actually starting to write their own testimony. And so just how you shared your testimony with them, this is the opportunity for them to have that foundation. They have the groundworks to be able to testify to others. This is what I have been thinking. This is what I have been wrestling with. This is what my life is categorized as. But after I met Jesus, this is who I became. This is what had changed. And so being able to track that now allows them for the future to be able to share their testimony with others. And so this is an investment for their personal spiritual futures as they come to know Jesus. And so with that, that wraps up our first hour conversation. And moving to our second hour, we're continuing in our series through I'm Here to Share Jesus. Now, this whole month's program is designed to get your children to understand that they have the opportunities to share Jesus in terms of multiple circles and multiple relationships that they have. So last week, they learned about how they can share Jesus with their families. And this week, they'll be learning how they can share Jesus with their friends. And they'll learn that by looking at John chapter 1, verses 43 through 51. And so during this story, we get to see how Philip, one of the disciples of Jesus, had an opportunity to encounter Jesus, but then also brought his friend, Nathanael, to Jesus as well. And so in this story, Jesus is still going about recruiting his disciples. And at first he comes and encounters Philip. And he just says a very simple thing to Philip: follow me. That's all Jesus said to him. And so in that moment where he's experiencing Jesus, when he finally got to talk with Jesus face to face, and he heard these things, Philip believed and followed Jesus. But what was the first thing that Philip did after he did that? After he heard from Jesus and put his faith in him? Well, he went and he found Nathanael, a friend of his. This is not someone he's related to, but someone he spent a lot of time with, an intimate relationship that he had with another person. And so he went and he found Nathanael and he said, hey, we found Jesus. Everything that Moses was talking about in the Old Testament, all of the prophets that are prophesying about this individual, this is Jesus. This is the Messiah we've been waiting for. Come, see him. And at first, Nathanael was unsure. In fact, he actually says, Jesus of Nazareth? Well, there's nothing good that can come out of Nazareth. That's just a weird place. Nothing good can come from there. Why would Jesus, this Messiah you talk about, come from that region? But Philip still encourages, please just come, see him, talk to him, experience him. And so Nathanael does, sees Jesus, and Jesus and Nathanael have a personal interaction where Jesus explains to him, hey, I saw you under that fig tree. I saw you the moment that Philip came and encountered you. I saw you there, and I wanted you. And Nathanael has a moment of faith. Now, this is a very simple story, but there's a lot of depth behind this. And so what we end up seeing is that Jesus had a heart for Philip, obviously, because he went and sought out Philip personally. But he also had a heart for Nathanael. Even though he didn't seek him out personally, he saw Nathanael. He saw him sitting under that fig tree and knew that he had to bring him to himself. And so even though Jesus himself didn't walk over to Nathanael, he might as well have by sending Philip instead. Philip had that change inside of his heart and just was so overwhelmed and overjoyed with who Jesus is, the fact that they had found the Messiah, that he went and found Nathanael. So inadvertently and indirectly, he worked through Philip. And on top of that, we also see that Jesus reveals himself in a number of different ways. And so for Philip needed to see and experience Jesus in terms of looking at the Old Testament. And we see that in the way that Philip responds to Nathanael. Philip knew the Old Testament. He knew what Moses had written down. He knew the law. He knew the prophets. And so when he interacted with Jesus, that part of his walk with Jesus was satisfied. In other words, he needed that more intellectual response. But Nathanael didn't respond the same way. When he was confronted with the same bits of information, Nathanael did not necessarily have faith. It said Nathanael needed a personal encounter with Jesus. He needed experience with him. And so when he came and had that conversation with Jesus, that's what transformed him. And so what we see is that Jesus reveals himself in multiple ways. He can reveal himself through the intellectual side. He can reveal himself through the experience side, and everything in between those things. And so Jesus has a heart for people. He understands people, and he knows exactly the right path to take to reach their hearts, to touch those heartstrings that are already primed to be able to receive Jesus. And so when we reflect on those things, that gives us the understanding and the knowledge that we too can actually experience Jesus, but we also have a responsibility to share Jesus with other people. That we can take that knowledge, take that experience, whatever it is that we needed to actually be able to know and experience and have faith in him. We could take those things, bring them to our friends, and hope and pray that Jesus would encounter them the way that they need to be encountered, the way that they need to have a conversation with him. But there's that responsibility for us to share. In terms of reflecting on these things and having conversations with your child, there's a couple of things that we can think through. So for the first point that we can make has to do with prayer. And so I want you to work with your child and think about an individual, a friend that they have, whether at church or at school, but a friend that they have that does not know Jesus. And I want you to challenge you and your child to take that person's name and just write it down somewhere that's very public and available for all the family to see. Somewhere like your fridge, maybe it's at your child's door, whatever it may be, but to actually write that child's name, write your child's friend's name somewhere in the house, and to work together as a family to regularly pray for that person. And so this gives you the opportunity to lead by example, that there are people not only in your child's life, but people in your life that don't know Jesus, that desperately need to. And to start thinking about, well, how do we actually engage them? And the first step there is prayer. So have an opportunity to constantly be in prayer for this person. Pray about where they're at. Pray that Jesus would be softening their hearts now to have that conversation later. Pray that Jesus would reveal himself to these people. And so just start with one name, one simple name, a person that's important to your child's life. And then you can use that as a springboard to start adding other names. Someone in your life that matters. Someone in maybe a relative's life that matters. And hopefully creating a little web of names of people that you're perpetually, constantly praying for, that Jesus would encounter those people, that he would save those people and draw them to himself. So just start with prayer. Secondly, now we can start thinking of a game plan of how do we actually get these people to experience Jesus. And so an easy way is to challenge your child to invite that person to church. So we have our programs that are running regularly on Sunday. And so that's an opportunity for your child to be bold about their faith, to be bold about what they believe in, to be bold in terms of their faith in Jesus, and to take that step to not just be praying and to leave it in our own personal lives and never bring it up and never encounter, but just start with an invitation. And so that's an opportunity for your child to really think through, am I willing to be bold like that? Do I have that kind of confidence? I mean, you could talk through your child about those things. Are they bold, or do they need the encouragement? That's something that you can pray for, work through with your child. But get them to a point where they can actually take that person that they've been praying for however long they have been, but to actually take that step, that really, really important step, to say, hey, why don't you come to church with me? Why don't you come to Sunday school with me? Why don't you learn the things that I'm learning? And so work with your child to come up with an invitation. And then thirdly, another thing that they can do is to work through, how do I actually start to share outside of church with these people? And so this could be at school during lunchtime, during recess. It could be after school when they're hanging out at each other's houses or playing sports with each other, or whatever it may be that they're engaged with. But when they're having intimate time with each other, this is an opportunity for your child to start sharing about Jesus. And that can look a multitude of different ways. It could look like just simply praying for their meal. It could look like saying what they've been learning and sharing what they've been learning with their friends. It could be bringing their Bible verse to school that day, that you would pack a Bible verse with their lunch for them to be able to reflect and remind themselves about. And that could spark a conversation. There's a number of things that you and your children can do to just begin to share their faith. And I think the intimidating factor about sharing Jesus as a child is it feels embarrassing. It feels like there's so much that I need to cover that I just don't know. I'm shy about doing these things. And that is a very real experience, especially because adults are experiencing that too. So what your child is experiencing is not necessarily unique or so different that it's concerning. It's a normal experience that they're going through. And so instead of taking this huge leap to be able to get to that point, take these little smaller steps. Again, try prayer during lunchtime. Try just bringing Bible verses with you that are actually physically printed out that your child can read. Try sharing what they've been learning. There's a number of things that they can do that's achievable, that's reasonable for them to do. And so work with your child to come up with a game plan for this upcoming week and the weeks to come. This is what we're going to try to do this week. I want to challenge you to try to pray for your meal every single time. I want to send you off in your lunch with a Bible verse, and I want you to read that before you start eating. Something along those lines so they can start getting into that rhythm of just introducing Jesus, and hopefully a conversation would follow after that. But just start with sharing little bits and details about their journeys with Jesus. And that brings us to an end with our second hour. So looking at our memory verses, there is a change to the first hour, but the second hour is going to stay the same. So the first hour memory verse is going to be John chapter 3, verse 17. John 3:17. And the memory verse for our second hour is going to be Matthew 28, verse 19a, just that first sentence. So again, Matthew chapter 28, verse 19a. And so hopefully you are working with your child to memorize these things. In fact, why don't you memorize it too? Why don't you work with your children? And this is an opportunity for you to hold them accountable by memorizing these passages yourself. So work with your child, but also memorize them as well. So that way the two of you can be reciting these things back and forth to each other. And so I'm looking forward to this week of ministry and being with your kids, being in the classroom and teaching them this week. And I'm looking forward to more and more meaningful interactions with you as parents and figuring out how we can best work together to disciple your children. But until then, love you all.